In the spring of 1956, the world was captivated by a real-life fairy tale. The tiny, sun-drenched Principality of Monaco was hosting the wedding of the century. Its handsome, brooding ruler, Prince Rainier III, was marrying Grace Kelly, the impossibly elegant ice-blonde queen of Hollywood. It was a fusion of ancient European royalty and modern American glamour, a story so perfect it felt scripted. We all know the images, the magnificent dress, the adoring crowds, the storybook romance that promised to save a struggling nation. But every fairy tale has its shadows. Behind the glittering facade of the prince's palace, another drama was unfolding. A darker, more Shakespearean tale of ambition, betrayal, and family schism. And at the center of this story was a woman who stood just feet from the happy couple, a woman whose own dreams were turning to dust at that very altar. She wasn't some distant, villainous relative. She was the prince's own sister, Princess Antoinette. Her story is the one you don't know. It's the story of a princess who, for a few tense years, came dangerously close to seizing the throne for her own son. It's a tale of whispered conspiracies in palace corridors, of ruthless ambition clashing with royal duty, and of a woman who, after playing the Game of Thrones and losing, was cast out by her own family, destined to live out her days in a self-imposed exile, a forgotten princess in the shadow of a fairy tale. This is the story of the other Grimaldi princess, the one who wanted a crown and ended up with a broken heart. To understand the audacious ambition of Princess Antoinette, you have to peel back the layers of tourist gloss and see the Monaco she was born into. This wasn't the billionaire's playground of today. The Monaco of the early 20th century, and especially in the years after World War II, was a fragile, fading jewel. It was a nation whose sovereignty was perpetually on a knife's edge. Antoinette was born on December 28, 1920. Her full title was a mouthful: Antoinette Louise Alberte Suzanne, Baroness of Massy. She was the elder child of Princess Charlotte and Prince Pierre of Monaco. But even this foundation was built on sand. Her mother, Charlotte, was herself the illegitimate daughter of the reigning monarch, Prince Louis II. In a desperate move to secure a successor, Louis had formally adopted his own daughter, making her the official heir. This act alone shows how malleable and precarious the line of succession could be, a lesson Antoinette would take to heart. She and her younger brother Rainier grew up in a household that was anything but warm and fuzzy. Their parents' marriage was a notoriously unhappy dynastic arrangement that ended in a bitter and public divorce. Princess Charlotte, disillusioned with her royal duties, eventually renounced her own rights to the throne in favor of her son Rainier, and largely retreated from public life. So, from a young age, Antoinette and Rainier were raised in an atmosphere of emotional neglect, marital strife, and the constant heavy pressure of their dynastic responsibilities. Then came the Second World War. Monaco, under Prince Louis II, attempted a precarious neutrality, a stance that became increasingly untenable as the conflict engulfed Europe. The Principality was first occupied by Italy and then by Nazi Germany. For the young royals, it was a terrifying and formative experience. It was a time of uncertainty, fear, and collaborationist whispers that would haunt the Grimaldi name for years. Antoinette was a young woman during this period, witnessing firsthand how quickly a nation's fate could turn, how fragile power truly was. When the war ended, Monaco was in dire straits. The casinos, once the engine of its economy, were struggling. The Principality was on the verge of bankruptcy. Prince Louis II was aging and increasingly disconnected. The future rested on the shoulders of his grandson, the young, shy, and untested Prince Rainier. And this is where the stage was set for our drama. Rainier ascended to the throne in 1949. He was a serious young man, determined to modernize his country and restore its fortunes. But he was unmarried, and he had no children. According to a 1918 treaty with France, if the Monegasque throne fell vacant with no heir, the principality would be absorbed into France. The pressure on Rainier to marry and produce a successor was not just a family matter, it was a matter of national survival. And in this vacuum of uncertainty, his ambitious older sister, Princess Antoinette, saw not a crisis, but an opportunity. She had a son, and she had a plan. Princess Antoinette's life was a slow-burn rebellion that ignited in the political vacuum of her brother's early reign. As the older sibling, she was intelligent, strong-willed, and possessed a keen understanding of the palace's inner workings. Yet due to the laws of succession that favored the male heir, she was sidelined. All the power and responsibility fell to her younger brother, Rainier. For a woman of her temperament, this must have felt like a profound injustice. In the years following Rainier's accession, Antoinette began to cultivate a public profile. She was charismatic and engaging, often representing the family at official events. While Rainier was perceived as somewhat stiff and reserved, Antoinette was seen as the more accessible face of the Grimaldi family. But behind this charming exterior, a dangerous ambition was taking root, watered by the whispers of her lover, Dr. Jean-Charles Ray. Ray was a prominent Monegasque lawyer and politician. He was clever, influential, and deeply ambitious himself. He and Antoinette became a formidable team. Together they looked at the state of Monaco, a bachelor prince, an uncertain future, and began to strategize. Their goal was audacious: to have Antoinette's own son, Christian de Massy, declared the heir to the throne. Christian had been born in 1949 out of wedlock, which was a significant hurdle. But Antoinette's own mother had been legitimized to secure the succession, so there was precedent. In 1951, Antoinette and Jean-Charles Ray married, and her children Christian, Elizabeth Anne, and Christine Alix were legitimized and formally entered into the line of succession, albeit behind any legitimate children Rainier might have. This was the first move on the chessboard. The second was a campaign of political destabilization and propaganda. They began to subtly, and then not so subtly, promote a narrative that Rainier was unfit to rule. They argued that he was more interested in his private life than in the affairs of state. They positioned Antoinette as the true patriot, the one who understood the needs of the Monegasque people. Their most ruthless tactic was aimed directly at Rainier's personal life. At the time, the prince was in a long-term, serious relationship with the French actress Gisèle Pascal. The couple was deeply in love, and marriage seemed imminent. Antoinette and Ray saw Pascal as the single greatest obstacle to their plans. If Rainier married her and had a child, their ambitions would be dead. So they launched a vicious smear campaign. The most damaging rumor they circulated was that a medical examination had proven Gisèle Pascal was infertile. This was a devastating blow. In a country whose very existence depended on the ruler producing an heir, the idea of an infertile princess was catastrophic. The pressure on Rainier became immense. The rumors, whether true or not, and many historians believe they were a malicious fabrication, poisoned the relationship. In 1953, a heartbroken Rainier ended his 6-year romance with Pascal. Years later, Gisèle would go on to marry another man and have a child, lending credence to the theory that she had been the victim of a cruel political plot orchestrated by Antoinette. With Gisèle out of the picture, Antoinette and Ray escalated their campaign. They orchestrated a petition signed by many Monegasque citizens calling for Rainier to be deposed in favor of his sister, or at the very least for her son Christian to be formally named as his successor should he remain childless. It was a move of breathtaking audacity, a direct challenge to her brother's authority. For a moment it seemed like the plot might actually succeed. The future of the House of Grimaldi hung in the balance. Rainier, however, was more resilient than his sister had anticipated. Shaken by the betrayal, he knew he had to act decisively. He needed a wife, and he needed an heir, and he needed them fast. His search led him famously to America and to the Hollywood star Grace Kelly. Their whirlwind courtship and engagement in 1955 was more than just a romance. It was a brilliant political masterstroke. The marriage to Grace brought Monaco unprecedented global attention, glamour, and the promise of American investment. But for Antoinette, it was a declaration of war. Grace Kelly wasn't just a potential wife. She was the beautiful, fertile, and universally beloved checkmate to all of Antoinette's carefully laid plans. When Princess Grace gave birth to her first child, Princess Caroline, in January 1957, the game was officially over. The line of succession was secure. Antoinette's dream of seeing her son on the throne had been irrevocably shattered by the cries of a newborn baby. The coup had failed, and now there would be consequences. Behind the grand theater of royal life, there is always the quiet, human story of family. For Princess Antoinette, her political defeat was followed by a deep and personal exile, a slow freezing out from the heart of the family she had tried to control. The emotional impact of her failed ambitions would echo for the rest of her life. Imagine the scene at the 1956 royal wedding. While the world saw a fairy tale, Antoinette must have seen the public coronation of her rival and the final nail in the coffin of her hopes. She stood there, smiling for the cameras, but inwardly her world was crumbling. Her brother, the man she had tried to undermine, was now fortified by a beloved and beautiful wife who had captivated the world. The power had shifted, decisively and permanently. Princess Grace, for all her poise and elegance, was no fool. She was acutely aware of the political machinations that had preceded her arrival. She knew that Antoinette had been her husband's adversary. While Grace was always publicly courteous, a distinct chill descended upon the relationship between the two women. Palace life became a landscape of unspoken tensions. Grace was now the First Lady of Monaco, the chatelaine of the Prince's palace. Antoinette, the former de facto First Lady, was relegated to a secondary and increasingly insignificant role. Her brother, Prince Rainier, was deeply wounded by her betrayal. Their relationship, already strained by a difficult childhood, was now shattered. Trust had been broken. While he didn't banish her from the country in a dramatic medieval fashion, he began a process of quietly pushing her to the margins. She was gradually stripped of her official duties. Her presence at major state functions became less frequent. The message was clear. She was no longer part of the inner circle. This ostracism was deeply isolating. Antoinette had thrived on influence and importance. Now she was adrift. Her husband, Jean-Charles Ray, the co-conspirator in her ambitious plot, also fell from grace. His political career in Monaco effectively over. Their marriage, built perhaps more on shared ambition than deep affection, eventually ended in divorce in 1974. Stripped of her political purpose, Antoinette had to find a new one, and she found it in a most unexpected place, with animals. She retreated more and more to her villa, Le Bout du Monde, the world's end, in the hills of Aise, just outside Monaco. There, she began taking in stray cats and dogs. What started as a small personal project grew into a lifelong passion. She founded the Monaco Animal Protection Society and turned her own home into a sprawling sanctuary, a refuge for hundreds of abandoned and mistreated animals. This part of her life is often seen as a footnote, but it's essential to understanding her as a person. Was this a genuine calling, or was it a way to fill the void left by her shattered ambitions? The most likely answer is that it was both. In her animals, she found a loyalty and uncomplicated love that the human world of politics and family had denied her. In her kingdom of the abandoned, she could be the undisputed ruler, the benevolent protector. The animals she rescued were outsiders, just as she had become. There's a poignant, unspoken empathy in that connection. One rarely discussed aspect of her emotional life is her relationship with her children, particularly her son, Christian Damacy. He was the boy for whom she had risked everything. In his own memoirs written years later, Christian painted a complex picture of his mother. He acknowledged her fierce ambition for him, but also detailed a life of feeling like a pawn in her games. He eventually moved to America, distancing himself from the hothouse atmosphere of Monaco, a move that must have been a source of further pain for Antoinette. Her grand dynastic dreams had not only failed, but had also strained the very relationship she claimed to be fighting for. So the image that emerges is of a woman living a life of profound contradiction, a princess living in a luxurious villa, yet surrounded by the noise and mess of countless animals, a member of one of the world's most glamorous families, yet profoundly lonely, a woman whose name was known across Europe, yet who was an outcast in her own home. The grand palace she had hoped to rule for her son was replaced by a chaotic, loving kingdom of her own making, a sanctuary for the lost, run by a woman who, in many ways, was lost herself. Was Princess Antoinette a wicked, scheming villainess straight out of a Disney movie? Or was she a complex woman trapped and ultimately broken by a patriarchal system? The truth, as it so often does, lies somewhere in the murky gray area in between. History has largely painted her as the villain of the Grimaldi story, the evil sister whose plots were thwarted by the arrival of the saintly Grace Kelly. And there is certainly evidence to support this view. Her actions were undeniably treacherous. She conspired against her own brother, the head of state. She engaged in a cruel and personal attack against an innocent woman, Gisèle Pascal, potentially ruining her life for political gain. She attempted to manipulate public opinion and seize power for her son, an act that could have plunged the fragile principality into a succession crisis and jeopardized its very independence. From the perspective of Prince Rainier and the stability of Monaco, her behavior was indefensible. She put her personal ambition above her duty to her country and her family. The historical narrative written by the victors casts her in this light. Biographies of Prince Rainier and Princess Grace often portray Antoinette as a one-dimensional antagonist, a necessary dramatic foil to their heroic story. She is the darkness that makes their light shine brighter. However, a more modern, nuanced interpretation might reconsider her motives and the context in which she operated. Let's look at the world from her perspective. She was born into a system where her gender automatically made her secondary to her younger brother. She was intelligent, capable, and politically astute, but the levers of real power were denied to her. In another era or another family, a woman with her drive might have been celebrated as a CEO or a political leader. In the rigid patriarchal world of mid-20th century European royalty, her ambition had no legitimate outlet. It festered, turning inward and becoming toxic. One could argue that she was simply playing the game by the rules she had been taught. She had seen her own mother, an illegitimate child, be made heir through a legal maneuver. She knew that succession was not always a straight line. Was her attempt to promote her son so different from her grandfather's decision to adopt his own daughter? It was a question of power, and she used the tools available to her. Then there is the influence of Jean-Charles Ray. How much of the plot was her own design, and how much was fueled by his ambition? Was she the mastermind, or was she manipulated by a man who saw her and her son as his own path to power? It's a classic historical debate, the powerful woman and her ambitious consort. Some accounts suggest Ray was the primary architect of the scheme, a Rasputin-like figure who preyed on Antoinette's insecurities and sense of entitlement. Separating their individual motivations is impossible, but it adds a layer of complexity to her story. She may not have been a solitary villain, but one half of a toxic partnership. The controversy, then, is not just about her actions, but about our interpretation of them. Do we see her as a purely self-serving schemer, or do we see her as a tragic figure, a woman of formidable abilities, whose potential was warped by the limitations placed upon her? Perhaps she was a proto-feminist figure, fighting for her place in a man's world, who simply used the wrong tactics. This view doesn't excuse her cruelty or her betrayal, but it does humanize her. It changes her from a caricature of a wicked sister into a recognizable human being, flawed and driven by a complex mix of love for her son, personal pride, and a desperate hunger for relevance in a world that was designed to render her irrelevant. The debate over her legacy remains because she embodies a timeless question. What happens when a powerful woman's ambition has nowhere to go? The ripples from Princess Antoinette's failed power grab spread far and wide, fundamentally reshaping the future of Monaco and the Grimaldi dynasty. Her story is not just a forgotten piece of palace gossip. Its consequences are woven into the very fabric of the modern principality, and it serves as a powerful cautionary tale about the corrosive nature of ambition. The most significant and ironic consequence of her plot was that it ultimately saved Monaco. By pushing her brother to the brink, she forced him to take the one action that would secure his throne and his nation's future. He had to marry and produce an heir. Her scheming directly led to Prince Rainier's search for a wife, his marriage to Grace Kelly, and the birth of Princess Caroline and Prince Albert. This union not only secured the succession, preventing a French takeover, but it also ushered in a new golden age for Monaco. Grace's celebrity and charm brought in tourism, investment, and a level of global prestige the principality had never known. In a strange twist of fate, Antoinette's attempt to destabilize the throne inadvertently became the catalyst for its greatest triumph. She had hoped to be the author of a new chapter for Monaco, and in a way she was, just not in the way she ever intended. On a personal level, the consequences were devastating and permanent. The rift between Antoinette and Rainier never truly healed. She became a semi-detached member of the royal family, a ghost at the feast. While she was never formally exiled, she lived in a state of internal exile, forever on the periphery. This family schism had lasting effects, creating a precedent for how the Grimaldis deal with internal dissent. Loyalty became the ultimate currency in the court of Rainier and Grace. The story of Antoinette served as a stark warning to future generations. The unity of the family is paramount, and betrayal will result in being cast into the wilderness. This duality is why she still matters. Her story challenges our desire for simple heroes and villains. It shows us that people can be driven by ugly motives and still be capable of great compassion. It demonstrates that a life can be defined by both a spectacular public failure and a quiet, private redemption. The princess who was ostracized by her own family created a new family from the outcasts of the animal world. There is a profound and lasting poetry in that. Her political legacy is one of division and failure, but her humanitarian legacy, though smaller in scale, is one of kindness and protection. It is this contradiction that makes her a perpetually fascinating and significant figure, a complex woman whose shadow still looms over the sunny fairy tale of Monaco. Princess Antoinette died in 2011 at the age of 90. She had outlived her brother, her sister-in-law, and many of her contemporaries. She remained to the end a complex and somewhat remote figure. In the glittering dramatic history of the House of Grimaldi, she is often remembered as a footnote, a villain, vanquished in the opening act of the glorious reign of Rainier and Grace. But perhaps the truest way to see her is not as a villain, but as a survivor. She was a woman who schemed to rule over a nation, and in her failure found a truer, kinder kingdom to reign over, a kingdom of the abandoned, the stray, and the unloved, where she at last was needed and perhaps at last found peace.